Welcome to Life Stories. In today's heartfelt tale, we follow Emily, a young widow running a small-town diner in Silver Springs, struggling to keep her late husband's dream alive. One snowy day, a simple act of kindness towards a mysterious stranger sets off a chain of events that changes her life forever. This inspiring story of compassion, second chances, and the power of connection will warm your heart and remind you of the true spirit of Christmas. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's begin today's story. Snow fell steadily over the quiet town of Silver Springs, blanketing the streets in soft white. Twinkling Christmas lights adorned the storefronts, reflecting off the snow and giving the town a postcard-like charm. Yet, for Emily Parker, this festive beauty felt distant and hollow. Inside her small diner, the atmosphere was warm but heavy with the weight of her struggles. The diner had once been a dream shared with her late husband, Michael. Together, they had envisioned it as more than just a business. It was a haven for anyone seeking a warm meal and a kind word. They had worked tirelessly to create a space filled with comfort and community. But since Michael's untimely death 2 years ago, the dream had turned into a battle for survival. Emily glanced around the diner, noting the checkered floors and the worn wooden tables. The neon sign in the window flickered weakly, mirroring the state of her spirit. Business had slowed drastically since the chain restaurant opened just down the road. The once bustling diner was now often empty, save for a few loyal regulars. It was early afternoon, and the lunch rush, what little of it there had been, was over. Emily stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the edge as she stared at a stack of bills. Rent was due in a few days, and the numbers weren't adding up. She let out a sigh, her gaze drifting to the photo of Michael that sat on the counter. In it, he was smiling broadly, his eyes filled with the kind of optimism she struggled to muster these days. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, Michael," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the quiet. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up, expecting to see one of her regulars. Instead, a man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the snowy street. His thin frame and tattered clothes immediately caught her attention. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes, dark and weary, held a quiet desperation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I don't mean to bother you, but could you spare some food? I can work for it, I don't mind. I'm just really hungry." His words hung in the air, and Emily's heart sank. She could see the pride he was trying to hold on to, the way his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. For a moment, she hesitated. The diner wasn't doing well, and she was barely making ends meet. But then she thought of Michael and the stories he had shared about his own struggles. Before they had met, Michael had returned from military service, broken and lost. A stranger's kindness had been a turning point for him, a reminder that he was more than his circumstances. "Sit down," Emily said gently, her voice firm but kind. "I'll bring you something warm." The man's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to say yes. He nodded and moved to a booth by the window, his hands trembling as he clasped them together on the table. Emily went into the kitchen, her mind racing. She ladled a generous portion of chicken soup into a bowl and added a thick slice of warm bread. It wasn't much, but it was something. When she placed the meal in front of him, he looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Emily nodded, brushing away the lump in her throat. "Take your time," she said softly. "I'll be here if you need anything." She busied herself at the counter, but her gaze kept drifting back to him. She watched as he ate hungrily, his hands shaking less with each bite. It wasn't just the food that seemed to steady him, it was the act of being seen, of being treated with dignity and kindness. When he finally finished, he stood and approached the counter, his movements hesitant. "I don't have anything to give you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily raised her hand, stopping him. You don't owe me anything, she said firmly. Just pay it forward when you can. The man stared at her for a moment, a mix of gratitude and disbelief on his face. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled note. He placed it on the counter and left without another word. Emily picked up the note, unfolding it carefully. The shaky handwriting revealed words that made her breath catch. You reminded me that kindness still exists. I won't forget this. Thank you for seeing me as a human when I felt invisible. As she held the note, something small and metallic caught her eye. Beside it lay an old military challenge coin, its edges worn but still bearing the insignia of Michael's unit. Emily's heart raced. How had this man come to possess it? Was it a coincidence? Or was there something more? She stood there, the note and coin in her hand, her mind swirling with questions. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of purpose, as if Michael's legacy of kindness was guiding her once again. This was more than an act of charity, it was a connection, a spark of hope in the midst of her struggles. And though she didn't yet know what it meant, Emily knew she couldn't let go of the feeling it had stirred within her. The next few days at the diner passed slowly, but Emily couldn't stop thinking about the man and the military challenge coin he had left behind. She kept the coin in her pocket, running her fingers over its worn edges whenever her thoughts drifted to Michael. The insignia of his old unit was unmistakable. It brought back memories of the stories he had shared about his service, moments of camaraderie, loss, and the strength he found in small acts of kindness. The man's note echoed in her mind. You reminded me that kindness still exists. She couldn't shake the feeling that his words were as much for her as they were for himself. For so long, she had felt invisible, buried beneath the weight of her grief and the constant struggle to keep the diner afloat. But now, for the first time in years, it felt like something meaningful had come from her efforts. One quiet afternoon, she found herself sitting in the booth by the window where the man had eaten. The snow outside was heavier now, blanketing Silver Springs in a serene hush. She sipped her coffee, staring at the empty seat across from her. Who was he? How had he come to possess Michael's coin? And why did his presence feel like more than just a passing encounter? Her thoughts were interrupted when the bell above the door jingled. A woman, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, stepped inside. Emily recognized her immediately. It was Margaret, one of her regulars, who always stopped by for a slice of pie and a chat. Afternoon, Emily, Margaret said, brushing the snow from her coat. Quiet today, isn't it? Afternoon, Margaret, Emily replied, standing to greet her. It's been a slow week. Margaret took her usual seat at the counter, her warm smile brightening the dim space. Sometimes it's nice when it's quiet. Gives you time to think. Emily nodded, pouring Margaret a cup of coffee. I've had a lot to think about lately. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Something on your mind? Hesitating for a moment, Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out the challenge coin. She placed it on the counter, watching Margaret's expression shift from curiosity to recognition. Well, I'll be, Margaret murmured, picking up the coin. That's a military coin, isn't it? Emily nodded. It belonged to Michael. At least, I think it did. A man came in a few days ago, hungry and looking for food. He left this behind after I fed him. Margaret examined the coin closely, her fingers tracing the insignia. You're sure it's his? Emily's voice softened. I'm not sure of anything, but it feels like more than a coincidence. Margaret set the coin down gently, her expression thoughtful. Maybe it's a sign, she said, her tone kind but firm. Michael always believed in second chances. Didn't he? Maybe this is his way of reminding you that what you're doing here matters. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. I've been trying so hard to keep this place alive, Margaret. Some days, it feels impossible. But when that man came in, she paused, struggling to find the words. It felt like I was doing something right. Even if just for a moment. Margaret reached across the counter, giving Emily's hand a comforting squeeze. You are doing something right. Emily. You're giving people a place to feel seen. To feel cared for. That's worth more than you know. The conversation stayed with Emily long after Margaret left. She spent the evening turning Margaret's words over in her mind, wondering if the diner truly was more than just a struggling business. As the snow continued to fall outside, Emily closed up for the night. She stood by the window for a moment, staring at the darkened street. Clutching the coin in her hand, she whispered, "If this is a sign, Michael, help me see what it means." The next morning, as she prepared for another day at the diner, Emily resolved to hold on to the hope the man's visit had sparked. She didn't know what the coin's story was, but she knew that kindness, however small, could create ripples far beyond her understanding. And maybe, just maybe, those ripples would lead her to answers she didn't yet know she needed. A week had passed since Emily had last seen the man, and life at the diner continued its quiet rhythm. The snow outside was thicker now, the streets of Silver Springs wrapped in winter's stillness. Emily tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts often wandered to the mysterious man and the coin he had left behind. She wondered if she would ever see him again, or if their brief encounter was destined to remain a small but meaningful moment in her life. Late one afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows over the snow-covered streets, the familiar jingle of the diner's bell broke the silence. Emily looked up from wiping the counter, and her heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway was the man, but he looked completely different. His clothes were clean and well-fitted, a tailored coat replacing the tattered one she remembered. His hair was neatly combed, and his posture had shifted from hunched and defeated to upright and confident. Yet, despite his transformation, his eyes still held the same quiet depth she had noticed before. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," Emily said, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and curiosity. The man smiled gently and stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat. "I wasn't sure if I should," he admitted, his tone warm but hesitant. "But I couldn't let what you did for me go unacknowledged." Emily motioned for him to take a seat at the counter. As he settled in, she poured him a cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "You look different," she said, her words carefully chosen. "Things must be better now." "They are," he replied, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Because of you." Emily raised an eyebrow, her skepticism showing. "I just gave you a bowl of soup and some bread." He shook his head, his expression softening. "It was more than that. You didn't just feed me, you saw me. At a moment when I felt invisible. You reminded me that kindness still exists. That's something I'll never forget." Her throat tightened as his words sank in. She hadn't expected her small act of compassion to have such a profound impact. "I'm glad you're doing better," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man reached into his coat pocket and placed a plain white envelope on the counter, sliding it toward her. "I wanted to give you this," he said, his tone sincere. "It's not much, but it's a small way to say thank you." Emily hesitated, staring at the envelope. Slowly, she opened it, revealing a stack of crisp bills, far more than she could have imagined. Her breath caught in her throat. It was enough to cover the diner's overdue bills and keep it running for several more months. "This is too much," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't help you for a reward." "I know," he said, his gaze steady. "That's what makes it so important. You didn't ask for anything. And that's why I wanted to give back. You gave me hope. And now I want to do the same for you." Emily stared at him, overwhelmed by the gesture. It wasn't just the money, it was what it represented. In a world that often felt cold and unkind, this moment was a reminder of the humanity they both shared. "You don't owe me anything," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was just doing what anyone would do." "Not everyone would," he replied gently, "but you did. And it made all the difference." For the first time in months, Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone in her struggles. And she wasn't invisible. This man, whose life she had touched with a simple meal, had brought her hope in return. As the man finished his coffee, the two of them shared a quiet moment of understanding. When he stood to leave, he offered her a small, knowing smile. "Thank you again, Emily, for everything." She watched him walk out into the snow, his figure disappearing into the white expanse. As she clutched the envelope in her hands, Emily realized that this wasn't just about saving her diner, it was about saving a part of herself she had thought was lost. The kindness she had shown had come full circle, bringing her a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to believe that brighter days were ahead. The following days felt like a blur of emotion and quiet contemplation for Emily. She couldn't shake the memory of the man's visit, the weight of his gratitude, or the envelope filled with more money than she'd seen in months. Yet, there was something about his demeanor, his words, and the way he had returned that left her with unanswered questions. One snowy evening, as the diner was winding down, the bell above the door jingled again. Emily turned to see him walk in once more, this time with a calm confidence that felt even more striking than before. He was dressed in a simple but elegant coat, his appearance radiating a quiet sense of authority. "Good evening, Emily," he greeted warmly, his voice steady and familiar now. "Good evening," she replied, a flicker of curiosity in her tone. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." He smiled, his expression almost apologetic. "I know, but I realized I owe you an explanation." Emily tilted her head, intrigued but cautious. "An explanation?" The man nodded and gestured toward the booth by the window. "Do you mind if we sit?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding, leading him to the booth and sitting across from him. The soft glow of the diner's Christmas lights reflected off the snow outside, casting a warm but quiet atmosphere around them. "My name isn't James Carter," he began, his voice calm but serious. "It's Nathaniel Bennett." The name struck a chord immediately, and Emily's eyes widened in recognition. "Nathaniel Bennett? As in Bennett Enterprises?" He nodded, his expression steady but tinged with vulnerability. "Yes, that Nathaniel Bennett." Emily stared at him, her mind racing. The man sitting across from her wasn't just anyone, he was the founder of one of the most successful companies in the country. The revelation hit her like a wave, and she struggled to process the transformation from the hungry man who had once walked into her diner to the person sitting before her now. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. "Why were you here? Why did you pretend to be homeless?" Nathaniel finished gently. "Because I needed to understand something I couldn't see from the life I've been living. For years, I've had everything: money, power, influence, but none of it felt real. My days became a blur of transactions and meetings, and I lost sight of what mattered. So, I made a decision. I left it all behind, at least temporarily, to experience life without the safety net of my wealth." Emily listened, her breath caught in her chest. "But why my diner? Why come here?" Nathaniel's gaze softened. "Because I was looking for something genuine. And I found it in you." The words hung in the air, and Emily felt a wave of emotions she couldn't quite name. "I wasn't sure what I would find," Nathaniel continued. "But when I walked into your diner, you treated me with kindness. You didn't know who I was. And you didn't ask for anything in return. You just helped. And it reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that there are still people who care, even when the world feels cold and indifferent." Emily's heart pounded as his words sank in. She thought of the soup, the bread, and the quiet act of seeing him as a person when he had seemed so lost. She had never imagined that her small gesture would resonate so deeply. "I didn't help you because I wanted anything," she said softly, her voice wavering. "I just couldn't turn you away. That's exactly why it mattered," Nathaniel replied, his tone filled with conviction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound journal, sliding it across the table to her. "This is a record of the time I spent away from my life as Nathaniel Bennett. I've written about the people I met, the lessons I learned, and the moments that changed me. Your diner is in here, Emily. What you did for me was one of those moments." Emily hesitated before picking up the journal, her fingers brushing against its smooth cover. She opened it to a page marked with a folded corner and saw her name written in bold letters at the top. Beneath it was a detailed account of their first encounter, written with a raw honesty that brought tears to her eyes. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, looking up at him. "You don't have to say anything," Nathaniel replied, his voice gentle. "But I want to do more than just thank you. I want to help you keep this diner open, to make it everything you and your husband dreamed it could be." Emily's breath caught as she realized the weight of his offer. This wasn't just about money, it was about faith. In her and in the small acts of kindness that had brought them together. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The soft hum of the diner's lights and the muffled sound of snow falling outside filled the silence. Emily felt an overwhelming sense of connection, as though Michael's belief in second chances had somehow led her to this moment. "I'll need some time to think about it," she said finally, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Take all the time you need," Nathaniel said with a smile. "But know that the offer is real and it's yours whenever you're ready." As he stood to leave, Emily watched him go, her thoughts swirling with questions and possibilities. The world felt different now, as if a door she hadn't known existed had just been opened. And for the first time in years, hope filled her heart in a way she hadn't thought possible. The days after Nathaniel's visit passed in a haze of reflection and cautious hope. Emily spent hours at the diner, her mind constantly drifting to his words and the journal he had left behind. Each evening, after locking up for the night, she would sit by the window, flipping through its pages, immersing herself in the raw, heartfelt entries he had penned during his journey of self-discovery. The snow in Silver Springs grew heavier as Christmas approached, blanketing the town in a serene white stillness. Yet, inside Emily's heart, a warmth had begun to take root. She thought about the people who came to her diner, the truck drivers passing through, the lonely widows looking for company, the young families trying to make ends meet. This wasn't just a place for meals, it was a sanctuary, a small beacon of connection in a world that often felt disconnected. On Christmas Eve, the diner was bustling, the familiar clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, and the warmth of shared laughter filled the space. Emily moved between tables with a renewed sense of purpose, offering refills of coffee, chatting with regulars, and sharing smiles with strangers. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Emily found a moment of quiet. She stood by the counter, gazing out the window at the softly falling snow. She thought about Nathaniel's offer, about the possibilities it presented, and about what it would mean for her to accept help. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. Turning, she saw Nathaniel step inside. He was dressed more casually this time, his coat dusted with snowflakes. His expression was warm and calm as he approached the counter. "Good evening, Emily," he greeted, his voice carrying a quiet confidence. "Nathaniel," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "Merry Christmas Eve." "Merry Christmas Eve to you," he said, settling into a seat. "The diner looks lively tonight." "It's been a good evening," Emily admitted, her smile softening. "People seem to find comfort here, especially this time of year." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze sweeping over the cozy interior. "That's because of you. You've created something special here, Emily." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but she quickly shook her head. "It's just a diner." "No," Nathaniel said firmly, his tone earnest. "It's not just a diner. It's a place where people feel seen, cared for, and connected. That's rare and it's worth fighting for." Emily hesitated, her hands resting on the counter. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said finally. I've spent so long trying to keep this place afloat on my own. Afraid to ask for help. Afraid to let anyone in. But you reminded me of something important, that I don't have to do this alone. Nathaniel's expression softened. A hint of a smile playing on his lips. You're not alone, Emily. And you never have to be. Taking a deep breath, she looked him in the eye. I want to move forward. Not just for me, but for the people who come here. I want to make this place thrive. To honor Michael's memory and to keep his dream alive. Nathaniel reached across the counter, offering his hand. Then let's make it happen. Together. As she clasped his hand, a sense of relief and excitement washed over her. This was the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild, to grow, and to create a lasting legacy for the diner and for herself. The clock struck midnight, and the last customer left, leaving the diner quiet once more. Emily and Nathaniel sat in the booth by the window, watching the snow fall outside, the soft glow of Christmas lights reflected in the glass, casting a warm, peaceful ambience. For the first time in years, Emily felt a sense of hope she hadn't thought possible. This wasn't just a new chapter for the diner, it was a new chapter for her life. And as the snow blanketed Silver Springs in a quiet serenity, she knew that the spirit of kindness and connection would guide her, just as it always had. Merry Christmas, Nathaniel, she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. Merry Christmas, Emily, he replied, his tone equally warm. Together, they sat in the quiet comfort of the diner, knowing that the true gift of the season wasn't in the lights or the decorations, it was in the kindness they had shared and the hope it had brought to their lives. As Christmas morning dawned in Silver Springs, the town sparkled with a fresh blanket of snow, reflecting the warmth of a season filled with hope and renewal. Emily stood in her diner, now bustling with life and energy, her heart full of gratitude. The kindness she had once extended to a stranger had come full circle, transforming not only her struggling business but also her spirit. Nathaniel's support and the connection they had forged reminded her that true wealth lies in the relationships we build and the compassion we show to others. This Christmas was more than a holiday, it was a new beginning. A reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could create ripples of change. Thank you for watching Life Stories. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. See you in our next story.